Hello again. Okay, so this week we're going to work through the chapter called Manage and Present Data Visually. So the first thing you're going to do is go to Fanshawe Online. You're going to download the file EXL08 Expenses. You're also going to download the Excel worksheet EXL08 Employee Expenses. And you're going to download the two text files EXL08 City Hall Employee or Expenses and City Hall Employees. All right. So I have changed this instruction from what's in the textbook. The textbook has you downloading an Access database. The problem with this is that if you're running with a Mac, the Mac doesn't recognize Access, so it won't work. So it's not a huge thing to, you can, if you need to download Access, you can read through the textbook on it. But for our purposes, just to make sure that we're consistent with everybody running the same samples, we're going to use the text files instead. So you will, if you're running with Office 2019 or Office 365, you will have to review the information from last week because you need to have the legacy text import wizard available. If it's not available, if you're running Office 2016 or earlier, you will have the get external data command on your data tab. If you don't, you'll have to modify it as we did last week. The instructions are on the video for last week, and they're also in Fanshawe Online in the content for last week, and there is a link in this week for doing that as well. Okay, so what we're going to be covering off on here this week, skill number 1 is looking at trimming data. So it's basically getting rid of extra spaces in your text. We're going to look at the left, right, and mid functions in skill 2. We're going to do some more work with charts in skill 3 and 4. We are going to look at templates in skill 5. We're going to go through the consolidate options in skill 6. Skill 7, we're going to create dual access charts. Skill 8 will show you how to create a chart template. Skill 9 and skill 10 are very basic, so we'll just quickly rip through those. Alright, so the first thing you're going to do is make sure you have the EXL08 expenses file open, and let's get started. So we're going to click on the Data tab, and in cell A1 we're going to import the data from the EXL City Hall expenses text file. So again, to do that, we're going to click in cell A1, which is where you want the results to go. You're going to go to the Data tab, and again, if you have an earlier version of Excel, you'll have a Get External Data option. If you have a newer version of Excel, you will have to go to Get Data, go to Legacy Wizards, and From Text. You're going to go and find your data, so wherever you happen to store it when you created this, when you downloaded your stuff from Fanshawe Online. So I'm going to bring in the EXL City Hall expenses file. So I'm going to click on Import. It brings up my dialog box in my Import Text Wizard. I'm going to click on Next. It's already tab delimited. I know that it's good because I can see that my fields are broken down properly. I'm going to click on Next. Now in this case, we do not want to import the employee's ID, so I'm going to click on that column and click Do Not Import. I'm going to go across to the far right. I don't want to bring in the total expenses, so I'm going to not import that as well, and I will click Finish. I already selected cell A1, but if you hadn't selected the cell, click on A1 now and click OK. Alright, so now what it does is it brings in your data, and again, if you forgot to not import the ID and the total fields, you can simply delete those columns out of Excel. That'll work as well. Alright, so I'm going to make the screen a little bit bigger so you can see. If you take a look at the employee names, they look fine, but what you can't really see very well is that there's actually a space in front of the name. If I go down here to the bottom, you can see, if you look at Julia, it's indented a little bit further on these rows. The same with Todd Austin. So there's, in actual fact, if I click on the formula bar, you can see that there is actually 2 spaces in front of the name. And spaces in front of a name can be a problem. Sorry, in front of any data. So why is I'm not, all right. Just making these smaller again so I can see everything on the screen. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to remove those extra spaces on those names. As I said, spaces can become very problematic in Excel, because as far as Excel is concerned, a space is a character no different than any other character. So if I was to do a length command on this text, it would be wrong because it would actually have spaces in there. Or if there were spaces after the name, it could cause you a problem when you expect a name to be just what it shows, and you don't and you want to get rid of the extra work. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually clean off the extra spaces. So we're going to go out here in the column I. We're going to go to formulas, and we're going to go to text, and we're going to go down here to the trim command. And you can see in the box it removes all spaces from a text string except the single space between words. So the field that we want to work on is the name, and we're going to click OK. And then we're simply going to double click the fill handle to carry that down. Alright, so now another common practice within Excel is once you have manipulated data in whatever way, you don't want to have it in two locations. So right now I have the last names in the first column and in the last column. The first column are the ones that are incorrect. I don't want somebody using the spreadsheet to look at the first column, not notice the spaces, and then do some work. So we're actually going to replace those. So I'm going to take the new names that we've created, and I'm going to copy those. And then I'm going to go over top of the first value, and I'm going to do a paste values. So notice if I do a copy, just a straight paste, I'm going to get a pound of reference errors, and that's because that relative addressing, because what we were really, the formula or the underlying value in the cells that we created are actually a formula that says equals trim A2. So I can't paste that because relative addressing would adjust the formula and give us an invalid value. But I can use paste values, which simply pastes the displayed value into the cell. So I'm going to do that. And again, a second way that I could have done that is that, whoops, I could have copied this, gone here and done a paste, Control V, and then I could have gone to my paste options button and selected values. So another thing that you should do, the textbook doesn't, but quite honestly you should, is whenever you have duplicate data like this, so we've got the trimmed values on the far right and we've got the replaced values on the far left, I no longer need column I, and I'm going to delete that column so that I don't have duplicate data sitting in there. Again, it's only so that down the road you're not actually working, you're wondering, why do I have this extra column, and then you just use the wrong values or whatever the case may be. So it just cleans things up. Okay, so that's skill number one. Skill number two, we're going to use the left, right, and mid functions to create a password. So we're going to click on the passwords worksheet. We're going to import. So again, I'm going to go to Data, Get Data, Legacy Wizards from Text. The file that I want is the one called City Hall Employees. I'm going to click Import. And again, I'm going to click. I don't want the first column, so I'm going to say Do Not Import, and I'm going to click on Finish, and I want it in cell A1. So what I have in here are first names, last names, email addresses, and office phone numbers. What we're going to do is we're going to use combinations of three of those four fields to create an initial password for an employee. To do that, we're going to use three new functions. We're going to use a function called left, which pulls the left number of specified number of characters from a string. Mid, which pulls a number of characters from inside the middle of a string, and right, which pulls the last X number of characters from a string. So what we want here is I'm going to click in E2, and I'm going to pull the first four characters of their last name. So to do that, I'm going to go to Formulas, Text Functions, and I'm going to use the function called left. And you can see in the thing it says returns a specified number of characters from the start of a text string. So the text string is their last name, and I want the first four characters. In the second one, I want the middle four characters starting at position 10. So to do that, I'm going to go to Text, I'm going to go to Mid, and it says the text string is their email address. My starting position is number 10, and I want four characters. And finally, on the last field, I want is the last four characters of their phone number. So I'm going to go to Text. This one is right. So as you can see, returns a specified number of characters from the end of a text string. I'm going to point to the text string, and I want the last 4 characters. Just as an FYI, I'm going to go back to the left one again. Right now it says pull the leftmost 4 characters from a text string. If the last name was only 2 characters long, say it was NG, then it would simply pull the 2 characters. Yeah. So if you're asking for 4 and there's only 2, it'll only just pull the 2. Okay, so now that I have each individual field, I have to join them together to make my text string, my password. And to join strings together, you use the concat function. If you're in Office 365 or Office 2019, you use the concatenate function if you're in an earlier version of Excel. So I'm going to go back to text strings. I'm going to go to concat, and I'm going to join my strings. So there's my first one, my second one, and my third one. And you can see that when I'm putting things into the function argument dialog box, it's actually building the string up here in the formula bar. So I've got equals concat bracket E2 comma F2 comma G2, and I click OK. And I now have my password. So I can highlight those 4, double click on the fill handle to copy them down. Now, just as a point of interest, I'm going to show you 2 other ways that you could have done this that would have saved you a little bit of time. You can do the whole thing in a single text, in a single function. So remember, when you have a function, so we're going to use the concatenate function, and the concatenate function can have up to 255 arguments, and those arguments can be numbers, text, or other functions. So in our case, we're going to use the concatenate function, and as the arguments in that function, we are going to have the left function, the mid function, and the right function. So let's start. So I'm going to type it in instead of using the dialog box. But well, actually, just use the dialog box. So I'm going to click on text. I'm going to go to concat. So my first function is going to be my left, or my first argument is going to be my left function. So the left most 4 characters from there. My second function is going to be my mid function. So my mid of my email address, comma, starting at position 10 for 4. And my third function, or my third argument, is going to be my right function, phone number for 4. And I click OK. And I have my result in one function instead of in one column instead of having to use 4. Another way I could do it, as I said earlier on when we looked at concatenate and concat, we said there is a short form, which is the ampersand. So what I could do is I could say equals left Martinez for 4 ampersand, and join to that mid for starting at 10 for 4 ampersand, and right phone number for 4. And that gives me the same result. Oh, that should be just the number 4. Okay, all right, so that's just different ways to do the same thing. Okay, so that's skill number 2. Skill number 3, we're going to start working. We're going to take a look at a feature within charts called Select Data. So I'm going to click on my employee expenses. You can see here that I currently have a chart. So I currently have a chart, and in that chart you can see that I have 3 data series. So the data series travel, data series lodging, and data series supplies. So for whatever reason, they didn't include the phone and the internet, and you can also notice at the bottom for the category labels it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because when they created their data they did not include the names, which they should have done. So there's 2 ways to fix this. One is I could simply delete the chart and rebuild it from scratch with the proper headings, but there is an option within the chart. So I'm going to click on chart, and in the chart tools menu I'm going to go to, or tab, I'm going to go to the design menu, and I have an option here called Select Data. So select data shows me that the data that is building up this chart. So you can see in the very first row it says chart data range, and it has the range highlighted in my data. So you can see that it's got title, lodging, and supplies. I'm simply going to expand that to give it the proper data. So if I look at my chart, you can see that the chart now has 5 data series, including phone and internet. I also can see that I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as my category labels. I can see them in the dialog, in the select data source dialog box. I'm going to click edit, and I'm simply going to select the proper headings, which are the employee names, and I'm going to click OK. And I'll click OK, and I've fixed up my chart. Now I can go in here, I can add a legend. Let's put one at the top, and so on. So all the other things that we could do with a chart. Okay, so now we're going to click on the monthly expenses chart. Now in this particular case, you can see that it has charted. So if I click on the chart, you can see that it is charted January, February, and March, but it has not included April, May, and June. And I can't simply grab all of this because they're non-contiguous. I need the data, but I don't need all the headings and stuff that are in between. So to do that, I'm going to go back to Design. I'm going to click on Select Data. And you can see that currently it has selected the January, February, and March data. I can now just click my Control key down and select April, May, and June. Right? So now you can see that my chart now has 6 data series instead of 3. And again, you can see that I have my category labels are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so those are incorrect. I'm going to click on here, and my category label should be travel, occasion, and so on and so forth. Okay, and I click OK and click OK. All right. All right, then I could add legends and all that other sort of stuff. Now, well, actually, let's do that. So I'm going to add the legend. So I'll put it at the bottom this time. So remember, what the legend does is it shows me what each of the different colors of the data series applies to. Now, in this particular case, if you were to look at this chart and I was presenting this to an audience, I would be saying, here's how we've done in travel over the 6 months. And here's how we've done in lodgings and supplies and phone and entertainment. So you can see that for whatever reason, the March entertainment value was significantly different than the other ones in that particular, the other months. So this is looking at saying, in the 6 months, how are we doing in each individual travel, lodging, and so on. I'll switch rows and columns. I'm going to click up here on switch rows and columns, and you can see now what it does is it says, all right, in the month of January, here's how we're doing with all our different expenses: February, March, April, May, and June. So all switch rows and columns does is exactly what it sounds like. It switches the rows and the columns, or it switches between the two different categories, so our axis, so that you can see the same data but shown in a slightly different manner. Okay, so that's what switch rows and columns is used for. And basically, it's depending on what you're trying to tell your audience is how you're going to decide which ones that you want to use. Okay, skill number 4 is talking about trend lines and text boxes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the employee expenses. So as you were looking at this data, you can see that, so let's take a look at, there's travel. So if I click on travel, it shows the data series. You can see how it's progressing over time. If I was to click on lodgings, I can do the same sort of a thing. So I can see visually how are my numbers changing. So if you take a look at entertainment, you can see how Deborah is doing versus Julia, and so on and so forth. What you can also do is you can create what is called a trend line. And what a trend line basically does is takes a look at your data, and then it extrapolates it forward or backwards, or you could simply do a show a trend line just to show how it's trending within the existing data, to give you a perspective on how things are moving along. To add a trend line, I'm simply going to click on the chart elements. I can either do it from the box here, or I can go up on the Design tab and click Chart Elements, and they're all here as well. I can click here, and I'm going to go down here to Trend Line. And it says, all right, which one do I want to trend? Well, in this case, let's trend travel. So I'm going to click on travel, I'm going to click OK, and it displays a trend line. Now what I want to do is I want to change that trend line. So I'm going to double click on the trend line to bring up the dialog box. And here I can say what kind of trend line that I want. So I could say I actually want this to be a moving average, or I'm going to say linear. And I can send under linear, I can say, and I want it to go out by 2 months. All right, I hit OK, and you can see that it trends out. All right, let me show you a second way to do that. I'm going to delete that trend line. So again, I'm going to go to trend line, but instead of just clicking on trend line, I'm going to pick the type of trend line that I want by clicking the arrow, and I'll pick linear forecast and travel, and that creates it all in one step instead of the way that I did it. If I wanted to make changes to it, I could, again, as they say, double click on the trend line to bring up the dialog box. If I wanted to display how it determined the trend line, I can display the formulas. I'm not a statistician, so I have no idea what the hell Y and R are for, but that's what they do. And I could change the type of trend line and so on. Alright, so I'm going to close that dialog box. I'm going to close this. Alright, so now I could, make the chart bigger and all that sort of stuff, but that's all just review of stuff that we've done in the past. Okay, so the other piece of skill number 4 is text boxes. So I told you earlier that when you're working with Microsoft Office, everything you do has to go into a container. In Excel, a container is a cell, but you can add more containers. This chart is a container, and within that container I have the ability to change the background color of the container, the line around the outside of the container. I can add special effects to the container, and then the contents of the container, the text, the chart, and so on, I can format those individually as well. If I click on a particular item, that's also a container. So my legend is a container inside the chart container. And again, I can change the background color of that container. I can change the internal colors of that container. I can drag that container, move it around. All right. So everything within Excel is built on this whole concept of containers. If I want to add text, so let's say I want to have some text on the trend line that says travel expenses continue to rise. So I want that text in the chart. I can't just type it in. I actually have to have a container to allow me to put that text into the chart. To do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Insert, and I'm going to create and add a text box, which is basically a container in which I can put text. I'm going to draw the text box, and I can type into it expenses, spell it, continue to rise. All right, I can click outside of the text box, and the text box is there. I'm just going to add a couple more words. Quarter over quarter. When I click off the text box, you can see that the other text that I added disappears. And that's simply because the text box itself isn't big enough to contain all the text. To fix that, I simply click back on the text box and make the box bigger. Now once I'm in a text box, I'm going to get a new menu tab called Drawing Tools. I'm going to click on Format, and within that you can see that I have the ability to customize that container, both the background of the container and the contents of the container. So here I've got the ability to change the shape. So if I was to click here, and you can see as I hover over top how the container changes with background color and fill and what have you. I can individually go in and change the shape fill color. I can go down here to gradient fill. I could put a picture, so I could find a picture and have that picture show as the background. Alright, so let's just pick one of these. I also have the ability to do shape effects on that container, so I can put a shadow, so you can see the shadow that forms around the outside of the container. I can put a reflection on the container, so the container itself is reflected. A glow, which adds a background color behind the container. Soft edges, which bleed out the edges of the container. bevel, which adds a bevel around the outside, and 3D rotation, which changes the orientation of the container. So all of those options are available to me in the shape styles. In the word art, I can change the text that's inside the container. So text fill would allow me to change the fill color of text. Text outline would be the outline around the text. So I could have the letter T with a red outline and white internal. Text effects are the same text effects that you saw in the shape, so I can add reflections and glow and all of that sort of thing to the text itself. And then word art is simply pre-built text effects. So you can see as I hover over top what that does to the text itself. Okay, so I'll just select this one. By the way, as you hover over top, it tells you what effects have been applied. So this one has fill black, text color 1, shadow, and so on. Okay, so that's basically text boxes skill number 4. Skill number 5 is all talking about talks about templates. So there are a number of pre-built templates. To bring up a template, you're going to click on File and click New. And you can see that within the templates you have a number of pre-built templates. You have thousands of them. If you go across, if I click on business, you can see that I get a list down the right hand side. So what kind of business? Well, I want schedules. So I could click on schedules and show pre-built templates around schedules. Or I could click on technology and see a bunch of different technology skills. Alright, so we're not going to worry about that. We're going to click the back button. We're going to go back to the pre-built ones. Personal are any personal templates that you might have created. We'll talk about that in a minute. Just a second here. So, alright, so those are new ones there. I can click here on personal. These are my own personal ones that I've created. Sorry, I didn't mean to click personal up on the suggested searches. So here, these are templates that I've created. So here's one for calculating pools at my golf course. And so on. Okay, so I'm just going to click on expense report. Once you click on a template, it will create a brand new spreadsheet based on that template. Okay, so now I've got this new workbook called expense report 2.1 whatever that is based on this, and so I can customize this template whatever I want. So here's the important thing about a template. When you create a template, the template stays. When you select File, New, and you use a template, the key thing here is that when you click on the Save button, it will treat it as a Save As. In other words, your template will remain whatever it was before you started, and whatever you have done to that work in your spreadsheet will be creating a brand new workbook based on that template. So the value to you as a human resources professional is that as you're building spreadsheets, quite often you're going to be doing repetitive work month after month or week after week that's very similar to the week before, but it's just different data. So let's use payroll as an example. If you're doing payroll, you might have a spreadsheet that does all your payroll calculations. And then next month you're going to use that same logic, but with a new set of data. So what you could do is take the January, so let's say you've created your January spreadsheet, you do all your work and you've got all your values and done. Now you're going to do February. So you open up the January one and you start putting in your February numbers. If you accidentally hit the Save button, you have basically replaced the January data with the February data, which of course you don't want to do. You want to keep your history. So with a template, what you could do is build your spreadsheet for all your payroll with all of your formulas and everything in place, but no data. And again, usually to create it, what you'll do is you'll create a spreadsheet. You'll put some test data in it to make sure that it works, and then you'll delete the test data, but you'll leave all your formulas and your functions in place. Then you would go into File, Save As, and one of the options you have there is Save as a Template. When you do that, it will save it in a special location on your computer. But then when you need to use it, you would simply go to File, New, Personal, find your template, click on it to open it, and then you could create your January data, hit it, Save, and it will create a brand new spreadsheet which you could call whatever you want, January say. Your template will stay the same. If you do have to make a change to your template, you would simply click on the template, make your changes and do File Save As and save it back as a template to replace the existing one. So that's basically the benefit of templates. Now in this particular case, we've created our expense report template. I want this template to be part of my expenses file. So I'm going to right click on the expense report tab. I'm going to click on Move or Copy. In this case, I'm just going to move it. So I'm going to say move that worksheet into my expenses workbook at the end. I'll click OK, and you'll see I'll now have a new workbook or a new worksheet within my expenses workbook called expense report, and I could do whatever I want with that. Okay, so that's basically templates, skill number 5. Skill number 6 is talking about consolidate. Now I'm going to just kind of work my way through this. I'm going to click on the consolidate workbook, our worksheet, and I'm going to click on cell A3. So basically what I want to do here, and what you'll need to do at this point, is open the employee expenses workbook that we started with. So remember, when you started with the instruction this week, there was an EXL 08 expenses, which is the worksheet you're currently working on, and there was a second workbook called EXL 08 employee expenses, which basically, let's just go over there now. So I'm going to click on my icon at the bottom for Excel. Another way to go to another open workbook is to click on the View tab and say Switch Windows. And let's just take a look at the employee expenses workbook. So in this workbook, I've got expenses for employees 1, 2, and 3 in the third quarter. So you can see the date that they incurred the expense, the name of the employee, and whatever expenses they spent on that particular date. In the fourth quarter, I also have employees 1 to 3, but I've added employee 4, 5, and 6, and I've added some more expense categories. I've added expense 5 or expense 6 and expense 7. I also, just to mix it up a bit, I've changed the order. So if I take a look at third quarter, expense 1 is in column C, expense 2 is in column D. In fourth quarter, I've moved expense 1 to column D, and expense 2 is in column C, and so on. So I've changed the order around, and that's to show you how the consolidate command works. So what I want to do is I want to have all of my employee 1 expenses consolidated into a single number for expense 1, expense 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. Okay, so if I look at my data, I can see employee 1 here has these expenses 1 through 5. So there's 1, and then there's another one here, and another one here, and another one here, and so on. And on this one, I can see there's employee 1 with those expenses, and there he is again with those expenses, and so on. So I want to add those all up and summarize them by expense type. So I want one number for employee 1 for expense 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7. Okay, so to do that, I'm going to go back to my my expenses worksheet, and I'm going to use a command called consolidate. Alright, so what you're going to do is you're going to click on column A, and you're going to click on the data tab, and you're going to click on consolidate. This will bring up a new dialog box called consolidate. If you have anything in the references box here, I want you to click on them and delete them. Okay, and if necessary, you might have to close the box and reopen it, but basically I want you to start with a box that looks like this. So in the function, you have the ability, what do I want to do with the data? Now in our case, I want to sum it up. So for employee 1, I want to sum up all of expense 1, and I want to sum up all the time I find him for expense 2 and 3 and 4 and so on. In your grader today, you're going to use the count function, which simply counts the number of times it finds. So in this case, it would say employee 1, it maybe say maybe he's got 7 different expenses, so it would just return the number 7. You also have average, max, min, and so on. So we're going to leave it with sum. Down at the bottom, you're going to see it says use labels in the top row and left column. You want both of those selected. Basically, that's because in my data, I want it to say find employee 1, and then find the column heading expense 1, and so on and so forth. This is why on the test data, I have the expense 1 moved so that it's not in the same position on the two different worksheets. It's to show you that when you use the consolidate command and you have the use labels in top row and left column ticked off, then what it will do is it'll use the column labels to determine which ones to consolidate, not their position. So it will say I'm simply going to look for employee 1 in the left column, and when I find it, I'm going to look along the top row and I'm going to find expense 1, and I'm going to total all those up. And then I'm going to go across and find expense 2. So it doesn't matter where physically they are as long as the headings are identical. And finally, we need to actually tell it what to consolidate. So click in the references, or in the reference box, and now we have to actually go to the other workbook and highlight the range of cells that contain the data that I want to consolidate. So I'm going to go back to View, switch window, and I'm going to go to my employee expenses worksheet or workbook. And in here, I'm going to highlight the data and the headings that I want it to do. So do not include the dates, because if I included the dates, it would consolidate by date, not by employee. So I simply want to consolidate by employee, by expense. So top row says employee expense 1, expense 2, expense 3, and so on, and left column says employee 1, 3, and 2, and so on and so forth. So what this is telling Excel to do is to find employee 1 and consolidate all of the expense 1 through 5, find employee 3, do the same thing, find employee 2, do the same thing. So once I've selected my range, I'm going to click Add on the dialog box. Then I'm going to point to my other worksheet because I want to consolidate that one. Because I've got more now, I have to expand my range. But again, I still have my headings across the top and my left column, and I'm going to click Add. Okay, so those are the only two. So if you had more, and understand, consolidate will work with worksheets within a workbook. It will work with workbooks. So I could have, as an example, if you had 5 different plants, each of your your HR managers in each of those plants is going to be doing a workbook to cover something specific to that particular plant. So let's say it's calculating absenteeism, and as long as my headings match, so I could have all 5 of those send me their spreadsheets. I would have those all open, go to my summary workbook, click on consolidate, and then I could consolidate all 5 of those into one. Okay, so once I'm done, I click OK. Now that leaves me in the employee expenses workbook. Well, I don't want to be there, so I'm going to go back to my expenses worksheet, and you can see what it has done is it's consolidated all the values that we had. So there's employee 1 for expense 1, so that if there was 10 employee 1s in there, it adds them all up and provides my value. That in a nutshell is the consolidate command. Now I'm going to finish this and then I'm going to show you another trick, but let's just, before we go, well actually let's do it now. There is also another command within consolidate called link. What I want to do is I don't want to mess up this spreadsheet, so I'm going to make a copy of this spreadsheet. So I'm going to click move or copy. I'm going to create a copy, move it to the end, and I'm going to click OK. So now I have a duplicate in this consolidate 2. My original data is still here. Here's my consolidate 2. I'm going to go back into data, and I'm going to click on consolidate. But now I'm going to click on this one that says create links to source data. Oh, before I do that, make sure you're in A3, because otherwise it gets really weird. So I'm going to go back, consolidate, and I'm going to put a tick box in create links. I'm going to click OK. So what that does is, if you were to, so it basically looks the same, but now I have these outlines down here that I can say, if I want to see my detail, I can click on 2, and you can see all the detail numbers that came up to give me my employee 1 1001. So these here, this is basically everything from the 3rd quarter worksheet, and this is everything from the 4th quarter worksheet for employee 1. So for employee 6, there was nothing on the 3rd quarter worksheet, so this is just 4th quarter worksheet. The important thing here is if you take a look at each individual cell, you see what it has created is actually a 3D reference. And remember what a 3D reference is you hit the equal sign and you point to the value you want and hit enter. So this has created a linkage back to the employee expenses workbook. In this case, you can see if I click on cell C4, it shows me that that value, that 101, came from the employee expenses workbook, the 3rd quarter worksheet, cell C4. So the value of this is that now if I made a change in my employee expenses workbook, then it would be linked into my expenses workbook. So anytime I reopen the expenses workbook, it will say the data has changed on the source. Do you want to update your destination? And you would say yes, and it would automatically update. Okay, so that's what the link does. It creates 3D references. I can click on one to show my detail. If I wanted to look just at employee 6, I can click there to show the detail for employee 6, and so on. Okay, so let's go back to my consolidate command. So now I want to finish this up. I just want to pretty it up a bit. So I'm going to add totals down here. And I'm going to put a total in. Now remember, when you use the auto sum button, you have two ways to do it. I can simply click on the cell that I want the value to be in and click auto sum. It will show me the function, and I can hit enter, and then I could use my fill handle to drag it across. A second way to do that is that if you highlight the range and then hit auto sum, it will simply fill in the values. So if you know that the range is correct, you can simply highlight where you want it, hit auto sum, and it'll create them all at once. If you're not sure if it's got the right range, then select a single cell, use auto sum to double check your formula, then copy it across. I'm going to do the same thing here to add totals by employee. And again, I'm going to highlight my range, and I'm going to click auto sum. So remember, the way auto sum works is that if there's a value above, it'll add the numbers above. If there are no numbers above, it'll add the values to the left, and that's why. So in this particular case, down at the bottom, I wanted the total for expense 1, expense 2, expense 3, and at the far right, I want the total expense for employee 1, expenses for employee 6, 5, and so on. Okay, all right, so now I have created my values. One other thing I'm going to do is, I really don't like the fact that it goes 1, 2, 3, 6, 4, 5, 7. I want to delete column, I want to move column 6, the expense 6 column, over between 5 and 7. To do that, I want to cut this column, but when I try to do that, I'm going to get an error message because I can't do that because cell A1 to I1 and A2 to I2 are merged. So what I'm going to have to do is unmerge these two. Then I'm going to click on column E, right click, and click cut. And then I'm going to click in front of column 7. So I'm going to click on 7. I'm going to right click, and I have the option here to say insert cut cells, which is basically going to take the employee expenses from where they were and move them in between 6 and 7. So now my expense categories move across fine, 1 to 7. And then I'm simply going to rebuild my merge and center. All right, the final thing I want to do here is I want to have proper accounting cell styles. So I'm going to select my first row, hold my control key down, select my last row, and I'm going to go to cell styles, and I don't need decimal points here, so I'm going to say currency 0. And then I'm going to select all my internal rows, and I'm going to go to cell style, and I'm going to say comma 0. And finally, I want to make sure that my total row has the cell style total on it. All right, so there I have proper accounting format. So you can see that employee 1 spent $21,000, employee 6 spent $5,000, and so on and so forth. All right. Okay, so that's consolidate. Skill number 7 is dual access charts. And because I messed around with the consolidate command, we're kind of out of sync now with the textbook a little bit. And so I'm simply going to, the textbook has you create 2 dual access charts. I'm going to simply create a single one. So what a dual access chart is for, and let me just show you, I'm going to select my data and my totals. Now normally I told you that when you're selecting data for a column chart, you don't select the totals, because if I select the totals, remember the value axis is determined by the largest number in the range of data. So if I include my totals, I'm going to have one column for total, which is really big, and then that $200 one for employee 6, expense 1, is going to be really, really small. So it's very difficult when you have totals included to be able to compare. But there is an option called a dual axis chart, where you can have one or more of your columns have their own axis. So let me show you. It's easier to explain after you've seen it. So once I select all my data, including my totals in this case, I'm going to go to Insert, and in my recommended or in my chart types, there's one here called Combo. Be aware, if you have a Mac, the combo chart type does not exist. So in the grader assignment, there are instructions on how you would modify your chart to be able to do this. You have to do it manually. So I'm not going to go through it in the instruction, but on your grader, when you read through the instructions, there'll be instructions in there on how to do that yourself. Okay, so I'm going to click on Combo, and there's three different types. So you can see clustered column line, and then there's this one here that says clustered column line on secondary axis. That's the one we want to select. So I'm going to click OK. It creates the chart, but in this case what it does is it automatically selects two of the data series and puts them on the secondary chart, which isn't what we want it to do. So I'm going to go back to change chart type, and on my all charts, now I'm on the combo chart, you can see now I have the ability in this box below to choose the chart type and axis for your data series. So in this case, I'm going to go down here and I'm going to see that employee 4 is showing as a line. Well, no, that one should be a clustered column, the same as the other employees. And it's also showing that he's on the secondary axis, so I'm going to turn that off. So, and I'm going to do the same for employee 2. I'm going to change that to custom column, and I'm going to turn off the secondary axis. But the total row, I want it to be a line chart. I could change it to line with markers or something along that line if I want. But I want it to be I want that total to be run against the secondary axis on the right hand side. So let me show you what it looks like when we're done here. Now, just so that it's easier to view, I'm going to move it to its own chart sheet. So I'm going to click on New Chart. I'm going to call this Combo Chart. Okay, so just looking at the chart, I can fix the chart title here. I could add a legend, but I've already got a legend at the bottom, so that's fine. I can move the legend around. All of the options that I have available, trend lines and so on, I can add using the chart elements. But the important thing here is now that you can see that on the left-hand side of the chart, I have axis. And that axis goes from 0 to 6,000. That axis is automatically created by Excel based on the largest value that you're charting against the left axis, in which case it's going to be employees 4's cost against expense 1, or employee 5 against expense 1. The total is charted against the axis on the right hand side, which goes from 0 to 14,000. Okay, so that way I can see a trend for the company at the same time as looking at the detail. So a dual axis chart says that I have some data that's charted against the axis on the left, and I have some data that's charted against the axis on the right. Okay, so that's basically how a dual axis chart works. Okay, now I also have skill number 8, talks about creating and editing a custom chart templates. I'm just going to briefly run through how you can create. So let's say I've created this template of this chart type and I want to use it more often. I can right click on the chart and I can say Save as Template. When I click Save as Template, you can see that it puts me in App Data Roaming Microsoft Templates Charts. By the way, this is going to be a huge problem for you in Fanshawe at the college, because that location, App Data Roaming Microsoft whatever, is not available to you. You don't have read privileges on that location, so you can save it there, but you won't ever be able to find it again. So you would then, if you were working at the college, and again, this isn't important because we're not going to worry about chart templates. They're not on your test, they're not on your grader assignment. I'm just showing you how they work. So here I can create a chart type. I've already created one before, so I'll just call this CAMS chart, and I'll save it. So then if I go back to my data, and let me just select the data again. Now I can go into Insert, and I can go to the launcher for charts. And if I click on all charts, then you can see that in my templates, there's CAMS chart right there. And This is I just as practicing for this, I created it already, so there's 2 of them in there now. So I could select that and click OK, and it will create the chart based on the template. Okay. Skill number 9, edit and save Excel file type versions. That's simply saying if you click File, Save As, you have the option within the chart, within the type, to select a lot of different types. So there's macro-enabled workbooks, there's old Excel 97 to 2003 workbook types, CSVs, XML data, single file web pages, templates, and so on. So there's CSV Macintosh, CSV MS-DOS, there's a text type, which is what we've been working on before, text Macintosh, and so on. So that's basically all there is for that. And skill number 10 we're not going to worry about at all, so we're not even going to cover it. Okay, so we'll go back to here, go back to our topics, and we have now covered off everything, and that's good. Thank you very much.